I was thinking about, what do teachers very commonly like overlook,
Yep.
because we're focusing on so many like other things, whereas the reality is that if you have really clean and succinct transitions throughout the entire class hour, it makes a massive difference, and we very rarely talk about it.
Well, and two, I think it kind of goes hand in hand with the idea that you plan it as a reaction. So, we so often, and I know like we've talked about this in the past, you so often like kind of worry about the meat of your lesson. So the lesson as far as like what the content is, you worry about the content delivery, what are students going to be practicing, how are you assessing them? All those things sometimes drive your thought when you're thinking through your lesson plan. And then sometimes you're like, oh, okay, how am I going to hook them in? Or what's the real, there's like some little things that kind of trickle. But it's almost like after you've had a group of students that don't transition well, that you're like, oh, I got to focus on this. And then you implement something. But really, the reality is you should be focusing on it in the beginning. You should be thinking through, because even the students who transition super well in a class that is, well ran, they could benefit from clean transitions just as much as kids who can't do that.
Well, and more often than not, to your point, educators are planning these like incredible activities for students. Like whether you're going like all out, like Instagrammable photo, or you just are thinking through like, hey, I have to have students practice a certain like problems.
Yeah.
I'm going to cut them up and paste them all over the room. Like there's so many ways to deliver activities that I think it's totally undervalued how you're going to get them into the activity and out of the activity. And this isn't just like transitioning into the room and out of the room, which I do think is super, super important.
Yeah.
But even like transitioning from like mini lesson to activity, or activity to reflection time, whatever your classroom setup is, and however long your class hour is. The reality is that regardless of what grade level you're at, you're probably doing like 7 to 8 transitions and like within that period of time with students at minimum. And we don't even think about it. Like that's not, I don't know. And
well, I guess let's first define what a transition is, because I think that sometimes can vary. So if you're a teacher that has the same group of students for a sustained period of time, so I'm kind of thinking like elementary, where you might transition in between subjects but keep the students. So to me, those transitions are not only in between courses, like subject areas, but they're also in between anytime students leave your classroom. So if they're going to lunch, library, PE, any of those things where they have to leave and come back, those are transitions.
Yep.
If you need them to get materials and then like prepping for an activity, that's a transition.
That's a transition. That's the one I think that is like not thought about. Like I'm going to explain directions and then you have to actually do something. Like anytime a teacher is explaining something and expecting a reaction from students, that's a transition.
And then also, like even if you're a secondary teacher and you only have students like for, maybe a 90-minute block or 45 minutes, whatever it is, even though you have transitions where students enter your classroom and leave your classroom, you still have transitions in between things, giving instructions. If you transition between, like if you're doing a mini lesson and then you get into the grid, like there's anytime students are changing what they are doing is considered a transition. And so it's, yes, you have to give it thought, but sometimes it can be overwhelming to think, what am I going to do for the 8 transitions I have in 45 minutes? But I think you and I have kind of learned over the years that there's some things that are like tried and true will work. And then other things that, maybe are like on your back burner, that if you need tricks for a group that really struggles with transitions. So, for me, it was like music. I always used music as a transition because it was easy. I always had Spotify open. I know I've talked on here before, but my kids always picked like their songs to play in our classroom playlist. So I would literally just like play a song and I would say, you have until the end of the song to transition until whatever I needed. And that was easy, quick, required very little like pre-prep. I had to have Spotify up, that's it. And that was something I could lean on all the time because even the best group of kids loved it. And then, the kids that struggled, they like could get into it.
Well, and it's a cue that you can be consistent with. I think the key with transition is having very clear expectations during the transition, which is the hardest part of transitions.
Yes.
So if you have a norm that music is when the transition is occurring and when the music like fades away, the transition should conclude. That actually in and of itself is a really, really, really good rule. I think the other thing, this came up because I was doing PD with a group of educators. It was a super small district, like kind of outside of Columbus. And it was a K-12. So like we had like all different grade levels, everything. And I made the dumb mistake. I was doing an activity, by the way, shout out to Dave Schmidt, who gave me this activity. But it essentially was an activity where in a minute, I was going to have them pair up with somebody in the room to do a 2-minute activity. And I made like the stupid premature teacher thing where I told them they would need a buddy in a minute, and instantly they were listening and they were looking around being like, you, me, partner, come over here. And you're like, you're not listening anymore. Like, but that's such a teacher move where even like explaining steps for a transition has a specific strategic order for it to go well. You can't tell them that they need a buddy before you explain the directions. You have to explain the directions and then explain that they need a buddy, because they'll hear the directions more efficiently. And like, that's why I feel like it's so underrated, because even if you play music during a transition, which is an awesome opportunity to pace your transition so it doesn't take too long, there's more that goes into it outside of pacing. It's language and all those elements as well that, again, so underrated.